Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a new interview every week that has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog www.majorionbowie.com, where I have new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. Today, I'm very excited to welcome special guest David Power. David is a composer whose music blends classical, jazz, ambient, and experimental styles, often blurring the boundaries between them. I'm often reluctant to characterize an artist's work. And so beyond what I just said, I'm going to ask David to tell you more about what it is that he does. The reason I invited David to come on the show today is his involvement with this extraordinary album, which you see the cover of behind me, Bowie, Berlin, and Beyond, which is an album inspired by the works of David Bowie and Brian Eno, especially off of Low and Heroes, but as the title tells you, and beyond. So it's not just limited to that. It's performed by the Delta Saxophone Quartet. It was released in 2018, but I'm embarrassed to say that I only became aware of it when David reached out to me. And he alerted me to a particular piece on the album, but I was captivated. I listened to the entire album. And if you're not already familiar with it, and especially if you're a fan of Low and Heroes or Philip Glass's Lower Heroes Symphony or the music of Brian Eno, especially his ambient music, you're going to want to go out and get this and listen to it. And you're going to be just blown away as I was. So I was really excited to invite David onto the show today to talk about this and what else he's doing. So David, welcome and thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let me ask you this right off the bat. You've described your pathway to contemporary classical music as starting with David Bowie. And that doesn't make sense to most people that are not themselves musicians. So let me ask you that. How did point A lead to point Z?
It was the instrumentals on Low and Heroes. I was 15 when I heard them, and I'd never heard anything like them before. I mean, they're not songs without words. They really are what we call tone poems. And I was intrigued by them, found out I loved them, and really wanted to learn to write like that. I found out that Eno played a big role in their creation, so I started to look into his work more. He'd done some classical stuff with his Obscure Records label, but also looking into his work led me to the krautrock period and ever more experimental stuff. And a name that kept coming up was Stockhausen, who I thought was a krautrock group, but it turned out he was a contemporary classical composer, and I didn't even know there was such a thing as contemporary classical. And Stockhausen's work is markedly more radical than Eno's or anything like that, but really powerful. And of course, when I then went back in time a bit and got into the Beatles, the Stockhausen's influences there over tracks like Revolution Number 9 and some of the other electronic effects on various tracks, and they themselves acknowledged Stockhausen's influence by including a picture of him on the front of Sergeant Pepper. So there was this sense that it seems to me that the rock world in the mid-60s moved into a more arty territory, which I liked. And I being young and liking the radical stuff, I moved totally over to contemporary classical and went through a period of writing very radical music. But then I kind of pulled back and wrote some piano pieces to try and find out what really mattered to me when external expectations were removed. And I found that it was still as much as ever Berlin era Bowie, Eno's solo stuff, early 20th century classical music. It turned out to be something that really mattered to me. And things like Stockhausen occasionally, every now and again, I'll still write in that more radical style. But I kind of found that crossover between experimental rock and experimental classical, and I seem to have one foot in each camp. It
Yeah.
just seems to be what works best for me, really. So that was the journey.
So somebody coming to this show who is only familiar with David Bowie or rock music, here's a term like contemporary classical. What does it even mean?
Well, in one sense, it simply means living classical composers that are working at the moment. But the classical world got so radical after World War II that it, they produced very radical, very experimental, very dissonant music. And without hearing it, it's kind of hard really to describe it. I suppose something like Frippanino's Index of Metal or Lou Reed's Metal Machine Music or something like that might give some idea. Probably the nearest in the rock world would be John Lennon's Revolution Number 9 on the
Yeah,
White Album,
yeah,
which is a straightforward imitation of the sorts of things Stockhausen does. But it is kind of hard to describe it without hearing it. It's very experimental music. There was a real sense after World War II that they wanted just to start again. Classical composers, by and large, aren't writing music anything like as radical as that now. But that was the period I got into. But I rode back from it, later on. But it's an exciting and an extreme place to go every now and again, and I think in that sense it's valid. But really, Revolution Number 9 is probably the nearest that I know of, but really
yeah,
the only answer is to listen to some of it. And Stockhausen's electronic stuff would be where I would suggest people start.
yeah. So I wasn't planning to ask this, so but I'm going to ask it anyway. I
Okay.
I was recently reading an article that was about the definition of classical music broadly, and it made the
Mm.
point that the same term applies to music from 1,000 years ago and music from I think it mentioned Philip Glass and uh, to the ear, the untrained ear, that's very different. And the the assertion was that classical music in its purest form exists on paper, whereas rock music in its purest form exists on an album. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah, that's kind of what I would say. Classical music is composed on paper, and rock music is composed in the recording studio. Why that makes the music sound different, it would be hard to say. I think classical composers learn what all the different instruments do very, very carefully because if you write for a violin, it will play there and then as a violin. If you record a violin in a recording studio, once you have the recording, there's lots of things you can do to change what that sounds like. But I think the notion that classical music is music composed by writing it down on paper, and other types of music, pre-recording studio music, folk music, things of that sort, maybe written by improvising and things like that. But
Yeah,
classical is written on paper. Yeah, I couldn't improve on that
yeah.
definition. I would agree with it.
So this particular article was about classical music, and it mentioned, the purest form of rock music is on an album, and it mentioned, like in passing, it mentioned the purest form of jazz is as it's performed, and it sort of explained that jazz, more than any other form of music, relies on improvisation, and therefore its purest form is performed. So why am I bringing this up? Is the album behind me, the thing that we're talking about? It's rock, it's classical, it's jazz, right? So how is it that the music, starting with the core of Low and Heroes, acknowledging that you go beyond that, how is it that 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 bass lends itself to having 3 feet in 3 different camps?
Well, the Deltas, they love jazz and they know a lot more about it than I do. I think saxophones are one of the sounds you would associate with jazz. I'm not saying
Yeah,
only jazz players play them. So I think the jazz elements in on the album are very much down to the Deltas themselves, as are the studio effects. I sat down with things like Arcticade and worked out what notes were being playing, wrote them down, and we played them live once. And then the Deltas took up the baton and got other people to do other arrangements. So three of the tracks on the album, Speed of Life, Warszawa, and Arcticade, are by me. Then David Lancaster's done Subterraneans, and somebody else has done Heroes, etc., etc. So it is very much a collective piece of work, but very much in the spirit of how Bowie himself worked in that sense, I would suggest.
Yeah. What's the origin of the album? It was released in 2018. How did it come about?
Some years earlier than that, I was running a little festival of new music, and it occurred to me that if things like side two of Low and Heroes could be a gateway for me into more experimental rock, I'm not talking about stuff as extreme as Stockhouse now. I'd left that behind by this stage. But I was listening to people like Philip Glass, Michael Nyman, Steve Reich, Howard Skempton, people like that, which seemed to me that people who liked side two of Low and Heroes, there was a fighting chance they'd like these classical composers too, if they could be lured to the concert. So I did the Arcade Warszawa, excuse me, and Speed of Life arrangement for audience development purposes, really. And I'd worked with the Deltas before, so I invited them to do a concert of those arrangements of those three pieces, plus people like Michael Nyman, Steve Reich, Philip Glass, etc. And the concert went well, and the classical audience liked the Bowie as much as the classical stuff. And the people who went because it's Bowie liked some of the classical thing. So I felt we were on something in terms of audience development. But Chris Caldwell, who leads the Delta Saxophone Quartet, he was more prescient than me. He thought there was more to that than this, and he felt there was an album here. So he asked other people to do other arrangements as well, and he pulled all of this together. He himself admitted that he didn't know about Bowie's Berlin work or the more experimental side of Bowie's work. He knew Bowie's singles,
Yeah.
the hits, but he didn't know this more experimental side. Chris is much more a jazz guy than the sort of experimental rock. So it was a journey of discovery for him, and a number of different people contributed. So the starting point was my arrangement, but Chris had the sense to take it a lot further along, and the quality of the album is really down to Chris and his guys. He really saw that there was something special here and delivered on it.
Well, I'm not alone in saying the quality of the album is really high. Once I listened to it, I started looking around for how was this received when it came out, and I found some really um, laudatory reviews. And I do this blog, and I listen to um, a great number of adaptations of Bowie, and not all of them work. And I mean, I'm being subjective here, but especially it's especially risky to try to adapt, I'll say Bowie's music, but pop music more generally into other genres. Sometimes it works and sometimes it really falls flat. What, aside from the virtuosity of the quartet, why did this work?
Well, I think it's because they're instrumentals that could just as easily work in the classical world anyway. And Eno was very rooted in the English experimental school of classical composers, and he brought a lot to the writing of them. Most of the music of Warszawa Eno wrote when Bowie was in Paris at the court case, and Bowie returned, liked what he heard, and added the vocals and that. Art Decade Bowie wrote as a piano piece, but Eno added the electronics. So because it was kind of atmospheric, not just a kind of song-like thing that happened not to have any lyrics, but was more kind of poetical, experimental, atmospheric. It could exist in the classical world. They could have been classical pieces, and of course Philip Glass did arrangements and turned them into classical pieces as well. Some of Eno's other work, the Plateau of Mirror album, Bang on a Can have played it as a classical work. I've done arrangements of some of Plateau of Mirror as well. These are works that could exist in either world, and because I've got one foot in each world, I like to try and bring the rock stuff that could exist in the classical world into it, and vice versa. You know, where there would be examples of stuff that could be very accessible. You know, I want people to hear it. So I think it's because it could exist in both worlds. So some things it would be hard to do an instrumental of something like Let's Dance or something. I think something would just slip out of that. I'm not sure that that would work. And the guy who did Heroes on the Delta album, he took it quite a long way away from the song. He used the themes and took them on a bit
Yeah.
of a journey. And I think that's why that one works. The Laughing Gnome one works because
Wow, that my
it's the
I
Laughing
was going to
Gnome.
ask you about that.
Yeah.
Put the album on, just let it play without really studying what it was I was about to hear, and all of a sudden I start hearing, wait a minute, what is that? That's not from Heroes. Is that the Laughing Gnome?
We kind of had to do that one. And the Alabama song, I wish we'd done more of that. I think that worked really well too.
Well, the
Yeah,
Alabama song is really interesting if you think about I mean, you did, but if you think about the origins, I think probably most people of our generation know of that either from the Doors or from Bowie, but
yeah,
the song itself is 100 years old,
yeah,
right? And so it started from a different genre altogether.
yeah, yeah,
That's an
yeah.
interesting journey.
Well, Bowie was very rooted in that Weimar era, Berlin culture, Brecht-Weill, things like that. So,
When I was listening to this, um, I I couldn't help but think of Donnie McCaslin, who was the band leader for Black Star. And
mm,
after Black Star, he came out with an album um, that included an adaptation of Warszawa on it. And the reason I couldn't help but think of it was not because the version on this album was so similar, but because it was so different.
oh,
And
right.
that the saxophone can can be as distinct as a human voice, which is not something that I appreciated, until relatively recently. I'm not a musician myself, and why is that? Is this Bowie had his own style of play of the saxophone, and it's almost like you could tell who's playing it based on
Mm.
style. Is that particular to the saxophone? Is it an especially adaptable instrument?
To be honest, I don't know. I don't play the instrument myself. Um, I'd have to think about that. I mean, something like a piano, you can tell who's playing from the style of how they play.
Yeah.
I guess there's so much variation that people can bring to it that they're bound to leave their own fingerprints on it. I didn't know McCaslin had done Warszawa. I must check that out. So it's very different from how we did it, is it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's you could recognize that it's the same piece of music, but
Mm.
if you play the one after the other, they sound very distinct.
Right.
It,
Yeah.
yeah, it's on his album Beyond Now, which he did with some of the same musicians that played on Black Star. And I've I've said if you like Black Star, you should listen to this
Mm.
because there's definitely a continuity. But what's really fascinating is that he adapted. He used some of the same ingredients to adapt the same song, and it came out differently. And they're both terrific. And if you think about you know, there's multiple adaptations of this song that um, they they don't come out the same. And I've often said that Bowie left us a lot to do. So
Yeah. Um, yeah, absolutely. I don't know it. I'll certainly check it out. I'm always intrigued to hear other versions of the things that we've done. So yeah,
yeah.
definitely I'll check that out. And as you say, he did leave a lot to be done. There's so many starting points where you can take the work in different directions. Yeah, it's very, very fertile in that sense, I think.
So by the way, and I'm going to ask this for a reason. What did you think of Black Star?
Um, I really, really found it unique at the time how he handled his death, really.
Yeah,
And I almost the video for Black Star, I almost this before I knew how ill he was, I found almost a little bit too dark.
yeah,
Was a bit thrown by it in a way I hadn't really been by a video of his before. Of course, when we found out how ill he was, it seemed to make a lot more sense. I thought the Lazarus track was one of the best things he's ever done. Dollar Days, I really, really like. But there's one or two tracks on it that I'm not as keen on. And I think as the years go by and the association with him, his death and that, I, I, I I wouldn't put it as one of his absolute top albums, maybe about a third from the top. But at the time, it was such a charged period. But things move on and things settle. So some amazing stuff on it, and one or two things that I'm not so
yeah.
keen. That would be my personal view of it.
Yeah, I asked that because it seems to me like I sometimes play this thought experiment of if one of his albums was released at a different time, how would it be
Mm,
received differently? And you know, you could disabuse me of this, but I imagine that if Black Star came out after Heroes, um, it there would have been a kind of continuity, um,
yeah.
right? As opposed to I know when Heroes Lodger, Scary Monsters, and then Let's Dance, but Let's Dance was in a way a more radical shift from what he had been doing previously than the thought experiment of if he did Black Star, right? It would almost seem like the connectivity between Black Star and what he did previously. I
Mm.
think it's easier to appreciate that if you listen to it after Low and then Heroes.
I think so, and you could use the same sort of argument with Outside. I think if it
Yeah,
had been No Heroes Outside. I remember when Lodger came out, and then when Eno and Burns' My Life in the Bush of Ghosts came out, and that latter album took the African influences further. And Lodger, Low and Heroes are two of in the same sort of camp in my book, but he'd already moved on again. And Lodger was only the second Bowie album that I bought on the day it came out. So initially I was disappointed by the lack of instrumentals and that. Then I thought he's done what he's always done. He's moved on again. And then I became reconciled to it. But the thought experiment is an interesting one. Outside and Buddha of Suburbia
yeah,
could come out in the
yeah.
70s. I think we'd feel the same way about Never Let Me Down whenever it came out. I don't think it would help that one, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
Um, but there is something about Black Star and the events wrapped around it, and in a different way, because I really didn't think we'd be hearing from Bowie again, except in sort of little bite-sized chunks. But when the Next Day album was announced, it was astonishing. I'd been on Bowie Wonderworld 2 or 3 days before, and no, so sorry, no, his own website. There'd been something like down for routine maintenance. No, I thought nothing of it. Then on his birthday that year, it was back up again, and there was Watch the Video and new album coming soon. So he really played a blinder with that one.
right. Yeah, no, I that came out. I had not yet started doing the blog, but I kept a journal of my reaction to that album, um, because I was listening to it over and over again for I don't know 3 weeks, and I was just
Mm.
recording, and I've lost the journal, but
Oh,
yeah. But yeah, no, that was extraordinary. I once got into an argument with somebody about I asserted that Hunky Dory is not a rock album, or I think the point that I made was without the song Queen Bitch, it would not be a rock album. And the person I was arguing with took great offense to that. And I'm mentioning this because I think, is it wrong for us to no acknowledging that David Bowie, of course, did rock music? Is it wrong for us to think of him as a rock musician?
wrong to think of him as a rock musician.
Yeah,
No, I don't think so. I mean, he himself wrote the "You Belong in Rock and Roll and So Do I." When I first got into him, I thought he was moving away from rock. He was
Yeah.
talking about becoming a painter and that's the late 70s. And I think he always had these other things, but he always came back to rock. You could argue that Hunky Dory is not a rock album, but I suppose you could argue the first Kate Bush album isn't on that basis either. Because it's voice and piano rather than guitars, drums, and vocals.
Yeah.
It's a matter of definition, really. Um, I don't know.
I'm going to
You
come
could
back to
argue,
when in a moment. I'm going to ask you more about how you would characterize your own work. But before we do that, I you mentioned um, your reaction to Bowie moving beyond, like when he came out with Lodger. And I've often thought that Bowie is one of the few musicians who gave his audience what they didn't want.
yeah.
And I don't know. I think you mentioned that you got Low when it came out. I'm a little too young to remember when Low was released, but I can only imagine if I really liked Young Americans, which was itself a radical change. But I really like Young Americans. I like Golden Years off of Station to Station. And I get this new album Low and I put it on. I'm like, what is this?
Yeah. Well, I'd only just got into Bowie at that stage, so I only had three or four of his albums, and it was Heroes is the first one I bought
Yeah.
on the day it came out. Um, and I didn't have Low. So I was amazed by the instrumentals, but I knew there was a lot of Bowie albums I didn't have. Lodger is the first one that when it came out, I already had all the previous albums.
Yeah.
So really, and he had said it was a trilogy, and I believe they did start working in the same way as they had with Low and Heroes, with some instrumentals for side two and songs for side one, but that got abandoned early on because Bowie found he wanted to go back to more lyrical writing. So Lodger was the first one where when it came out, I knew all the albums up to that point. And excuse me, I had to realize he changed again. He'd moved on again. Scary Monsters, very strong, but a very kind of strong rock, and it got such good reviews. I think there was a kind of relief that he'd stopped being so experimental. Um, there's a kind of revisionist in the Bowie community that everybody was sort of really bothered and worried by Let's Dance. I can only say that I wasn't. I just thought it was another intriguing step, and it's a strong album. The first time I thought there was an actual problem was when Tonight came out, because it's not that I particularly minded him doing more middle of the road stuff. It's just that apart from a few tracks, it's not a very good album, in my view.
Yeah.
But Let's Dance isn't really my kind of music, but it's good for what it's trying to do. I mean, the title track is an amazing piece of work. And there's still, in things like Ricochet, there's still kind of bits of interest, a really good cover of China Girl. But Tonight really, in my view, has relatively little to commend it. And that's where, but I was moving on into the classical world by then, so it sort of mattered less, really.
Yeah. It also suggests that what we do with music is different. So something like Let's Dance, I'm saying you in the second person. I don't mean you personally, but you appreciate Let's Dance in a different way than you appreciate Low.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this, that um, if you went to see your arrangements performed by a sax quartet, I would imagine that the audience would be seated and would be appreciating the music. But if the same audience went to, the Serious Moonlight tour, they'd be up, moving around and jumping up and down and shouting. And I was thinking about, again, I was too young to attend, but some of Bowie's late '70s concerts where he would shift, and the live album Stage, which has, in its original form, it was a double album, and one album side was all Ziggy songs, and then one
Yeah.
album side was all instrumentals. And I could just
Mm.
imagine, it's like, okay, get up, get down, get up, get down.
Well, I don't know. I didn't go to 78, but in 1983, I went to Serious Moonlight thing. And it was at the NEC in Birmingham, and we were all seated. People couldn't stand up at that concert. So I don't really know what it was like at the earlier ones. But of course, the way they did stage wasn't the order that they were played in the concert. And I think on the more recent versions, they've reverted to putting the tracks on the order
Yeah.
that they were on the album. And apparently, there's very little applause because the instrumentals got booed. So they had to remove the applause for that, and then they thought, well, we can't have no applause for that, and lots of applause for Ziggy, so they removed that applause as well. I'm not completely sure if that's apocryphal or not, but that's what I've heard, and it's got a ring of truth about it.
That's it. I did not know that. That's
It may be wrong.
so. In the beginning, when I introduced you, I made a meager attempt to try to characterize what you do beyond this album, and let me ask you to put it in your own words. What is your type of music?
It is halfway between Eno and some some of the less radical classical music will be where it is now. Um, Anybody who knows something like the Brian Eno Harold Budd album, The Plateau of Mirror, would would probably get where my piano music comes from. The songs that I write, again, there's a big Bowie influence there because Bowie was the first person I'd heard who wrote lyrics that were kind of evocative without being too specific.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of some would say, I went to the dance and da 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 da. But Bowie would come out with weird lines like theatre of financiers and field of weir paper, things that were very evocative, but you couldn't really pin down what they meant.
Yeah.
In the classical world, we're not really expected to write our own lyrics. The view is that we're musicians, we're not wordsmiths, and we should set poetry, which, to be honest, suits me because I never felt I was very good at writing lyrics. So I tend to look for poets that have that sort of quality that Bowie's lyrics have, evocative without being too specific. So you you'd probably hear songs that voice and piano songs, but there are people in the rock world that do that. But it's a classical style of singing, which may not be for everyone. But it's really it's very hard to describe music. I would just ask people to jump in and have a listen. The piece that really enabled me to find my voice was a little piece called Eight Miniatures for piano, and that's on a CD called 100 Years of British Piano Miniatures on the Naxos label. If people want to try those,
Yeah.
that's probably a good place to start.
I
And
was
it's
going to ask, like, if somebody gets this album, listens to Bowie, Berlin, and Beyond, and likes it, and wants to hear more of what you do, is that what you would recommend they go to?
the Eight Miniatures would be a good starting point. Yeah, there
Yeah.
is a little piece of my own on the Bowie one that I should mention called the names Shades 3,
Yeah.
and briefly went out of my head. So that would give people a sense of what I do as well. But yeah, the miniatures is as good a place as any to start, I think, really.
Yeah. You mentioned Brian Eno, who worked with Bowie, I think, on 4 albums, the Berlin trilogy and One Outside.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about what Brian Eno actually did with Bowie.
Mm.
So let me ask you, what did he do, and what did he do specifically with Bowie on those albums? And if you want to, we could focus on Heroes and Low.
Well, firstly, I think it was Eno's discrete music that came out, I think, in 1975 that Bowie really liked. And
Yeah,
Bowie had also been getting into some of the German acts like Neu and people like that. So I think first and foremost, Bowie realized that Eno was somebody who could really take his work somewhere else. Many major artists have collaborated with Eno since then, but as far as I know, Bowie is the first sort of really major artist to collaborate with him. In terms of what Eno really does, according to Bowie himself, he does what he calls what ifing. What if we take the bass out? What if on a song like Sound and Vision, uh, there's it's a long time before the vocals come in, and there's things of that sort. In terms of what I know about the writing of the tracks, Warszawa, almost entirely wrote it himself. Bowie was, I think I mentioned this, was away in Paris on a court case, and he wanted a piece, a very kind of studied, somber sort of piece about the Eastern Bloc. But that's really more or less all he told Eno. Went away. Eno did the work, liked what he'd done, thought if Bowie doesn't want it, he'd pay Bowie for the studio time and use it himself. But Bowie did like it and added the vocals, and they did the joint credit for Moss Garden. Bowie simply asked Eno to play some of the ambienty synthy kind of materials. Bowie then improvised the koto melody on top of it, and they both added the little electronic bits. On Sense of Doubt, they used Eno's Oblique Strategies card, and it sounds a
Well,
little
what is that?
that's a set of cards that have got instructions on it. If you're struggling for inspiration, you'll take one of them out. And one of them says something like, honor thy error for its hidden attention. And another one says, emphasize difference. And another one says something like, keep doing the same thing. The story about Sense of Doubt is that Bowie got the emphasized difference is one, and Eno got the continue in the same way. It sounds a bit too good to be true, but that's the story they tell. And so in Sense of Doubt, you've got the dum 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 that keeps coming back, but each time something different responds to it. So it is sort of credible that that's how they wrote that. Subterraneans and Weeping Wall, as far as I know, Eno had nothing to do with those tracks. Subterraneans came from some material Bowie wrote for the aborted Man Who Fell to Earth soundtrack. Weeping Wall with the marimba, the vibraphones, and that very much sounds like Philip Glass and Steve Reich sound world. So I think it varied from piece to piece, really.
Yeah,
Um, but I think he's very much a kind of catalyst who kind of makes things happen. But really, for me, his biggest role was alerting Bowie to the potential of instrumental music itself and the exciting things that were happening. And Bowie very presciently wanted a part of that and did some amazing work. And there was other groups rushing off to Hansa to record there, other groups rushing to work with Eno, but Bowie was the first major one,
yeah.
as far as I'm aware.
When you mentioned the oblique strategy cards, to somebody like me who has never worked on an album and haven't, don't really understand what goes into making an album, I get confused as to how is that type of input distinct from what a producer does, because Tony Visconti was the producer.
Yeah, that's a bit of a sore point because a lot of people think that Eno produced the album, and of
Yeah,
course he didn't. Um, it's in another sense, I suppose when it comes to the instrumentals, you could argue that did some producing work, but I think he kind of co-wrote them.
yeah,
It's hard for somebody like me because it's very expensive being in recording studios. In my rock music days, we'd have pretty much everything ready and rehearsed to the last inch really before we go in the studio. The notion of going into the studio and then making up the songs there and then, for financial reasons alone, it just wasn't really viable. But I understand that that's how a lot of outside was recorded in the studio there and then. So for me, I kind of share your kind of puzzlement about how you could really work like that. But I suppose a combination of a certain pressure because you're paying to be there and you're paying the musicians to be there could generate a certain creative tension that would emerge. I can see that. Um, but yeah, what even Bowie said, well, on an interview, well, what does Brian do? And I'm not sure he was even completely clear.
yeah. It's fascinating. Um, So when you create a piece of music and you put it on a record, it exists forever, which is great,
Mm,
right? And so
mm.
this is an album that we've been talking about, Bowie, Berlin, and Beyond, that is now, I guess it's 7 years old.
Yeah.
But I'm just discovering it now, and hopefully some of the people that are watching this interview will be discovering it. And I really think that it would lend itself to a live performance. And I know that it was performed live in 2018 and 2019. I'm sitting over here in Albany, New York, in the US, and I don't think it was ever performed in the US. Do you think that there's any chance that it might be?
I'd love it to be performed in the US. It has had a few performances other than the first one. And we really need festivals or concert promoters or somebody to invite us over to do it. We'd absolutely love to.
Yeah.
So any suggestions gratefully received.
Okay, I'll talk to you after.
Okay, okay, yeah.
So we've actually been talking for a while, and I feel like we could talk about many different things. And I don't know if you'd be interested in coming back, but we could have a part two. But I'm conscious of your time, and I'm going to sort of wrap things up today. Um, but I want to ask two closing questions. The final one of which I ask everybody, and it's sort of silly. But before I ask that, I want to ask you, because we could have touched on many different things in this conversation, is there anything that you want to bring up before we wrap up?
Well, first, I'd love to come back. Thank you for the invite. Um, no, I can't really think of anything. I suppose I would just, I suppose other areas that Bowie has influenced me is the quality of the videos that he made,
Yeah,
and the only films I knew by sort of rock stars before I went to see The Man Who Fell to Earth were the Beatles ones and the Elvis ones and people like that, which were sort of relatively feeble films that were really vehicles for singing the songs. But The Man Who Fell to Earth, a classic science fiction film made by Nick Rogue when he was at the
yeah,
height of his powers. And I just think for people who don't know Bowie's work, younger people, I don't know how well younger people know it. There really is a treasure trove of stuff to enjoy and to learn from. If people want to do creative stuff, I know that Bowie himself said that a lot of his fans had gone into visual arts, designs of things of that sort. So he was very aware of that sort of influence. So yeah, I think
yeah.
that's what I would add. But we really would love to bring the Deltas over to America. That would be great.
Great, terrific. So let me ask you that. Here's my final question, which I ask everybody, which is, what is your favorite Bowie album and song?
The album oscillates between low and outside. Um, Favorite song, I think, will change a lot. I listened to No Plan the other night,
Yeah,
and I really really liked that. But that will kind of change all the time, really. Um, yeah, no, there's really so many. I've a feeling there's. I'd probably say Sweet Thing Candidate, Sweet Thing Reprise, because of the length and the quality of it,
yeah,
um, and the diversity. But other, one way I look at it is even with his worst albums, there's two or three absolutely first-rate songs on them.
yeah,
Loving the Alien, absolutely first-rate song in my view. Time Will Crawl, absolutely first-rate song.
yeah,
Betty Wrong, first-rate song for me. So I suppose I would sort of say that's even at the worst. There's superb song, and there's so many as well. I mean, 26 studio albums, I think it is. Then other little things keep being found. I found a track he did with Earl Slick called "Isn't It Evening." I only
yeah,
found it a few years ago. People have known it for many many years. I only found it recently. It's an amazing track.
yes,
So I would just say there's a treasure trove out there, and if you don't know it,
yeah,
uh, you explore it. And then there's the art. a mixed bag in some ways, but those Dead's paintings really seem to me to add something to what he's talked about for many, many years about his interest in freaks, isolationists, and alienated people. The Dead series of paintings seem to me to kind of visualize that and really add a dimension. So just loads to discover.
Yeah, and loads more to discuss. So
Yes.
David Power, thank you for joining me today. I will invite you to come back because it's really been a delight in having this conversation with you, and I think that there's so much more to discuss.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Good.